Hey, what's up, everybody? Everyone, welcome to another episode of the Victorious Ones podcast, the place where gaming meets comics, meets sports, meets movies, as well as inspiration. I am your host, King Von Jr. You can follow me on social media. Of course, you can see at the bottom of the screen on Twitter/X at 301 King Von Jr. You can follow the show's Twitter page at VictoryPod1. I'm also on Instagram at Mr. King Von Jr. You can follow the show's Instagram page at Victorious Ones Podcast. I'm also the social media producer for Perfect Plex Talk Radio, hosted by a friend of the program, Mike Knox. And first and foremost, before I get started, I want to say thank you very much for those who tuned in last week. With friends of the program, Black Wrestling, as we discussed the BRP 50, an amazing episode. You know what I mean? Like I felt like that was the penultimate episode so far of this podcast, and that says a lot with 240 plus episodes. So thank you very much. For the crew over there. You know what I mean? Shout out to Cal, shout out to Fam. Who were able to represent, and even to those who weren't even on. Mimi, Math, as well as DDM. And thank you very much for the contributions that you make over on that network, and that was a tremendous episode, great recap and great list. Very much critically acclaimed. You know what I mean? And so maybe continue to have many more of these lists and great episodes. You know what I mean? And so I definitely had my thoughts about it. I shared them already before, and of course, congratulations to Trick Williams for being number one. Congratulations to him and Lash Legend for getting married last week as well. Number 1 and 24 getting married. So pretty soon, Mello and Kalani are going to be coming up next, 15 and 16. Side note, those who rank very high on the list, definitely make their presence known, with them this week. But yeah, I'm going to talk more about wrestling a little bit later. But first and foremost, I'm going to go over some of the pop culture, if you will, outside wrestling related news a little bit. Whether it's some comics, especially when it comes to the NBA, as well as even with. Excuse me. There's been a scorcher out here too, by the way. Excuse me. And but yeah, like I said, as far as this past weekend, I was at this expo, the Amazing Art Expo, and so they had some voice actors over there, and so I got the chance to meet the guy who played the voice of Robin on Batman the Animated Series, Lauren Lester. Like I said, that was Robin / Nightwing. And of course I got his picture, his autograph. It was great. You know what I mean? So the chance to see Nightwing, in real time form, that was amazing. And of course, as far as that, I got a chance to to just also to support my cousin whose son already graduated high school and stuff like that. So had a graduation cookout over the weekend as well. Outside of that, of course there was especially when it comes but that's just out other news outside personally. I know that there's definitely been been quite a shakeup when it comes to the world of the NBA. As we all know, breaking news: LeBron is no longer with the Lakers, and so now the LeBron sweepstakes start once again. So there's this huge mystery swirling around as it pertains to his next destination. And where he will land, only time will tell. So it's very cryptic right now, probably more than ever before. I've had people ask me, I've had my parents ask me, what do they think, where do I think LeBron's going to go? The chances are saying, he could be going to Golden State. I guess, as a farewell ring, if you will, to get a chance to unite with arch rival Steph Curry, for the final countdown. And we already know that Golden State's, window, is rapidly closing, if not closed already, basically. But want to reheat the nachos, I guess to get together for one last little super team thing. They're all at the tail end of their careers. So like as far as that's that's probably like the most talked about one. talks he could possibly be going back to Cleveland. Um, but if he does go to Golden State, it's just like it would amaze me if he were to go. Yeah, people have so much smoke for for KD when he went. But that's another topic for for another time. I'm just saying, it's funny how people won't keep that same energy as far as that's concerned. But I guess because it's it's much later in your career, they won't won't be on the case as much. But yeah, that's pretty much the way I see it. Excuse me for a moment. Sorry about that. But yeah, like I said, it definitely amazed me, as far as that's concerned. And only time will tell. We only have 3 months left until until the new season starts. And so that's definitely a huge talking point. When it comes to this, and of course, Giannis is with Miami. Um, so in NBA news, it's the off season, got people real funny. You know what I mean? But yeah, it's definitely quite a few shakeups. The Knicks lost one of their pieces, to Boston recently. Found that out, and yeah, so as far as that's concerned, and also that Sony released a bombshell announcement that 2028 will be the very last year that that PlayStation will have physical copies. Will actually have CDs. That'll be the very last time that the games will be in physical form. And moving forward, that everything's going to be downloaded in digital form. And several PlayStation fans, myself included, I can't rock with that. And it's just like it won't be the same. And especially when it came to some of these PlayStation hacks and things like that, people who who had physical media weren't impacted as much as those who downloaded their games digitally. And it's just the way that the society's in, with all this AI stuff like that. That's just like, come on now, like this is just just getting too far. Certain things I think still need to still be standard, standard physical form, and the gaming, the disc, still need to be that way, as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, but that those are some of the main headlines in terms of in terms of pop culture. And I noticed also that that recently there was some discourse in regards to Lupe Fiasco, constantly taking shots at Kendrick Lamar, and all this discourse in terms of in terms of lyrics, in terms of like lyricism versus production and things like that. And I'll say it like this: no matter how complex you are lyrically, if your message is going over people's heads, and it's falling on deaf ears and things like that, it's not going to be received well. So the thing is, you have rappers like that who have a niche audience, niche fan base, where those lyrics resonate more. But when it comes to some of the main general public, it's not going to translate very well. It's just like and the thing about Kendrick is that he can be technical when he wants to, but also at the same time he knows how to you know um, relay a message to a larger audience, to when it comes to talking about his community and just you know society and everything like that, in general. So he has a better way to better approach, or a better like I said, just a better way to communicate to the listener, if you will. And also, and the thing is, when it comes to his pen game, he's not a slouch himself either. And so I think because like I said, Kendrick's never going to slouch when it comes to lyricism, when it comes to writing. Even if that's not the main thing that he focuses on, he's very well balanced very prolific when it comes to that. And then all these other boxes he checks off when it comes to production, when it comes to, like I said, when it comes to just, just being able to cross over, being able to translate very well to, to a larger audience. When we talk about his body of work, when you talk about his accolades, I mean, like the fact that people want to talk about this still in 2026. You know what I mean? And there's no way you can name 100 rappers better than him. Absolutely not. So that's just, that was just out of jealousy, for him to even say that. You know what I mean? Kendrick is certified. He has outpaced Lupe in more ways than one. It shouldn't even be a talking point. So I'm not even going to spend a whole bunch of time on that. So, you know what I mean? Like, just leave it alone. That's like the way Dame Dash, goes at Jay-Z, but Jay-Z pays him no mind. Same thing. But yeah, but of course, but I'll say, on a lighter note, I'm going to get into, some of the main things I really want to talk about, especially when it comes to X-Men 97. Happy X-Men 97 Season 2 day, by the way. Because today was the day of, the official premiere, of X-Men, of Season 2 of X-Men 97. Speaking, I talked about this, about a few episodes ago. And so yeah, like as far as that, and of course, as far as that, of course, the season premiere today, there were 3 episodes that dropped today, 3 of them, right? And I like the way that they focus on like 3 different timelines, right? So you have the past timeline with early Apocalypse. You have the 1997 timeline, which is technically quote unquote present, if you will, in that aspect, right? Because the main story takes place within the late 90s, X-Men 97, right? And so you have that, you have the the past Apocalypse timeline, the early Apocalypse timeline, if you will. You have present 97 timeline, and you have the future timeline, like Days of Future Past, type of timeline. So they deal with they go with the Days of Future Past theme, which I do like. And so, like I say, and the thing is like the way that like I said, the different events that occur, within those timelines, and how each episode has a focus on those. And so of course they're so in the future they're in a Scotty timeline. I'm saying the name right, but but of course that's when Cyclops and Jane, of course, going to the future, right? Like I say, the future from compared to where they were in '97. So like I say, they fast forward and going on an adventure with with a teenage Nathan, who eventually become Cable. And so by this point, like I say, by this point, Cable, like I said, he's a teenager, the early phases of his powers and things like that. And the thing about it is that they are on a time limit, because of the fact that if they stay too much longer, that's going to have an impact on on the future in and of itself. And I definitely like I definitely enjoy the family dynamic between Scott, Jean, and Nathan, right? And how before they end up leaving, they just speak words of affirmation over him, what I mean, and just let him know how special he is, how gifted he is, and everything like that, and they realize for themselves, without them even realizing, without them even knowing, how he was already a telepath very early in his life, even at that age, so it's like when they're speaking to each other telepathically, he was able to hear it as well, and what I mean. So as far as that, and just like I said, just that glimpse of like like I said, of early cable, and that was just really a sign of things to come. And I definitely like the way that sorry about that, but I definitely like the way that Storm taps into another sort of dimension of her powers, and and of course the dynamic between her and Forge. You know what I mean? Like how they really dive even deeper into that romance and sort of dynamic as far as that's concerned, and also I definitely like some of the dates of future past, callbacks and references, especially when when you look at Wolverine and how this version of Wolverine, like I said, the Days of Future Past, Savage Wolverine, I forgot what the name of it was, but this is where he has the bone claws, and so clearly this is a continuation of what happened. Clearly the continuation of what happened after Magneto ripped the adamantium out of his bones after at the end of season 1, and so I was like, I said, of course I definitely like that. And I would say that for Cable to stand out the way he has, whether it's teenage Cable or adult Cable, you could definitely tell he's a very pivotal part of the story, right? And how they're prophesying, predicting for him to become the one to defeat Apocalypse, right? And so of course, meanwhile, meanwhile, when it comes to like I said, pretty much split off in pretty much three different timelines, right? And so so that was pretty much in episode 1, and then when it comes to episode 2, they go into when it comes to the X Force versus X Factor. X Force consists of Cable, Jubilee, Psylocke, Psylocke, Archangel, and Sunspot, right? And of course, like X Factor consists of Havoc, Polaris, we'll see, multiple man. I forgot what his name was. The guy who was able to make clones of himself, and then the big strong dude, with the glasses and like the bald head or whatever. But of course they let it be known that X Factor is is the C-list C-list mutant squad, and the thing about it is that X Force, they are the fugitives on the run that are they're fighting for for mutant rights and everything like that, and it's kind of given like a Captain America Civil War type of vibe. Meanwhile, X Factor, they are the mutants that that want to have peace, that want to have peace between mutants and humans, but the way they're doing it, the way that they are, the way that they're collaborating with their enemy, with their adversary, and it's just like like the way that they're cooperating with the government, and really really against the best interests of fellow mutants. So translation, X Factor are ops. X Factor's giving very MAGA, and I was like, it's definitely giving traitor. And I like how how Jubilee called Havoc, and I like the way that Jubilee call Havoc a team of Cyclops or Cyclops knockoff or whatever, and of course refer to them as C-list, which they really are. And plus, Havoc, of course, Havoc is Cyclops brother, so I definitely like that callback with that, and it was great to see, great for them to show, show the way that that Psylocke train Jubilee to to have the hands that she has, because Jubilee was dishing out BTA, if you will, belt to what. And I was like, and she was definitely Jubilee was definitely getting busy, and all while wearing headphones too, all while listening to music. You could definitely tell. I was like, yeah, she took it up a whole notch. And I mean, all for the sake of her escape. I was like, yeah, and the thing is, Jubilee just read them for filth. You know what I mean? Like, for them to work for bigots in DC and stuff. I say, oh, yeah, this is definitely a mirror of what we see with society, with this administration and things like that. I said, and the thing about the X-Men is that when it comes to topics like this, they're never ever afraid to tackle them. And X-Men, when it comes to socially, they know how to be on the right side of history at the end of the day. And and also, of course, also, I know that the way the Cable recruiting looked a little suspect, for him to show up at an arcade, and it definitely gave uh, hints of Captain America from Civil War. When he had the hat, wearing the hat as a disguise, and it just, and of course, it tapped into Cable having more of a personality compared to where he was in the original cartoon, right? And really, if anything, this series has overall, like, even ever since season one onto this, that, like, I mean, I'll say from the time of Gambit's death, like, where eventually, of course, Cable step up more, um, right? Going into this, like I said, this whole thing, especially when it comes to exploring that going to that family dynamic, um, and of course him becoming a leader in of himself. Like I said, we're seeing more uh, of Cable's personality like we've never ever seen before, right? And um, and the thing is, like I said, I already commended them on on the way that they gave him more of a spotlight, but even more than ever before, we're definitely seeing that in real time. And and like and the thing, of course, he made sure to to lay down the ground rules when it comes to when it comes to when it comes to Jubilee and Sunspot, just to make sure that they were focused on the mission, and obviously which they were. And and I do like a Sunspot's costume with the little Ninja Turtle, a bandana reference. I thought that was pretty funny. And but yeah, but also at the same time, it shows even within that group, the different dynamics, right, and how like I see like how their approaches are different, and how how Psylocke and Jubilee and them, how they want to be more reasonable, and meanwhile Cable is just a straight up mercenary, like he ends up killing, assuming he ends up killing one of Apocalypse henchmen. I said, all right now, we we definitely going to going to another arena right now. I said, wait a minute now. All right. That definitely definitely caught me by surprise, and and also of course with the Emma Frost, and of course they don't want like as far as that, I guess they don't make it like too much of a scammer, if you will, but yeah, as far as that, I think they could have done a little bit more with that exchange, but yeah, like I said, as far as that, and of course, Archangel, made sure to, to just, to continue, to have his foot on, on the neck of, of Apocalypse, if you will, when it comes to, when it comes to that mission, when it comes to that type of mission, and and so as far as that, like, if anything, Archangel definitely still on stood on business. Really, everybody did. But like, but I'll say, my favorites, out of this, Salak and Jubilee, without question. And then also, um, when it came to uh, episode 3, when they're of course, when Magneto and Xavier and them, of course, when that team, of course, some son, like son, of course, since they've already, like since they've already moved out of that previous timeline, of course, now they're, like I said, now they're in the apocalypse timeline, and and for them to be in that, uh, sort of leadership clash, right? Um, especially when Xavier already knows, who Apocalypse when it becoming. He's just got his original name in Sabiner, and pronounce it right, but like I said, that's super young Apocalypse, and so we see Magneto becoming besties with Apocalypse, and even Nightcrawler was saying this is really a test of faith for real, because they're at the hands of their most ruthless uh, adversary, being Apocalypse, along with their most merciful uh, adversary, being Magneto. You know what I mean? And so of course, Magneto tries to reason with them, tries to find the best in them, um, only for only for things to blow up in their face, and of course, like I said, for Apocalypse to at first he wasn't killing nobody, he was showing mercy, but then later on, we see this dude cut somebody's head off or something. All right, now, and that was their cue to go ahead and make the exit to be continued. And of course, next week is going to be episode 4. So anything that they're going to be dropping, one episode per week, moving forward. You know what I mean? And so of course, episode 3. It's not episode, but season 3 and season 4 have already been greenlit and approved. And there was even somebody pointed out an Easter egg about those caskets, and one of them was Gambit. So there's hopefully he may end up showing up this season or even next. As far as that, and plus even at the end of season 1, when Apocalypse picked up their card, that was a reference to to the Horseman of Apocalypse, and Gambit ends up returning as the Horseman of Death. For those that are familiar with the X-Men, X-Men Lawrence storyline, and Age of Apocalypse, and Days of Future Past, and things like that. So like I said, I definitely see this dynamic with where they're going with this. And like I say, the MVPs, like I say, Psylocke and Jubilee. So that's as far as that, and also I definitely like how. But like I definitely like how Cable, made the reference, saying that children are tougher, are tougher than we think, and they show this flashback, like I say, Cable had, of course they show adult Cable, and then they show Cable when he's a kid. I was like, yeah, that was definitely, like I said, a double entendre, a reference and whatever. But yeah, like I said, as far as like I said, those are my main takeaways when it comes to X-Men '97 season 2, and so I know next week I'm definitely looking forward to. But but of course, so of course now it's time to get into the main, like I say, of course, now it's time to get into the main topic of of this show. And of course, I'm going to give my recap of WWE United Champions, which took place in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Which we already know that over on this end is going to be during the daytime, 1 o'clock, during the heart of the day, during brunch or whatever, whatever you got going on that day. And so I'm going to give a recap of the matches. We see that of course, The Queen of the Ring goes to Io Sky. She defeats Liv Morgan in the finals. So of course, Seth Rollins defeated Braun Breaker. Trick Williams defeated Ricky Saints to retain, to retain the United States Championship. Tiffany Stratton defeats Jade Cargill to retain the women's U.S. title, and of course, for the men's, for the King of the Ring, of course, Obafemi defeats Jey Uso to become the King of the Ring, and in a surprise turn of events, Sami Zayn defeats Cody Rhodes and Gunther in a triple threat match to become the new WWE champion. Sami wins in Saudi. I never thought I'd say that. Not only that, but he's a WWE champion. He was the least likely on my list to become the WWE champion. I thought it was, part of me thought it was going to be business as usual, possibly Cody, but I believe that if there was anybody that was going to get the W, who was going to become the new champion, would have been Gunther. As far as that's concerned. But Sami wins in Saudi. That was all right now out of the blue. So I was like, wow, that just a complete turn of events. So now, as far as the King and Queen of the Ring, I'm glad that Io won, but they need to go in a whole nother direction when it comes to this whole Liv Morgan thing, because as far as that's concerned, I felt just the internet's having some Liv fatigue, if you will, and it's especially considering the fact that that she put herself into this tournament. If anything, that just diluted it, to be honest with you. And of course, there's talks of them keeping the belt possibly on Liv, just to hold on for 75 here, but that's just delaying everything else. So if anything now, they have apparently she's gonna obviously now in a storyline, in the feud with Io, because you can't keep holding this thing up that much longer. And obviously we saw that Liv tried to ambush Io on Raw, and so as far as that, and then of course not only that but Liv try to get Danhausen to interfere, but of course Danhausen end up cursing Liv, and she ends up losing, and of course Judgment Day's cursing up themselves. They just as far as that's concerned. But the thing is, they shouldn't have messed with Danhausen in the first place. You know what I mean? So if anything, Danhausen, don't mean nobody no harm. You know what I mean? All he wants, are human monies. And so yeah, that's if anything, that's really what it was. And also, but like I said, as far as that's concerned, and then when it comes to, when it comes to Trick and Ricky, I figured that was going to happen anyway, because I believe that eventually they're going to pull the trigger when it comes to Trick and Mello, because that's inevitable. That's bound to happen. Now, when it comes to Jade and Tippy Time, I picked Jade, but now we see this collision about to take place, if you will. This all roads lead to SummerSlam, so it's looking like all roads are going to lead to Jade versus Charlotte, because Charlotte interfered. So that's one thing, for her to knock Jade out cold, with the U.S. title, and so Jade has been cheated by Charlotte out of the, of course, out of the women's title and out of the U.S. title. So two of them. So yeah, so it's definitely a bigger story, between them. So if this is what it takes for us to finally get to this point, say it, but let it be, right? Even though I always said that that it really should have been at WrestleMania, but I digress. At least, looks like we're gonna end up getting it at SummerSlam. So it's one thing for Charlotte to be involved, but what really got me was Chelsea inserting herself and aligning with TV time. And the reason why that got me is because of uh, Chelsea's previous history, previous history with Jade online, and just the shade that she been thrown at her um, repeatedly online, unprovoked. And I've had people tell me that it was work. At the time that this was taking place, there was no storyline, between Jade and Chelsea, at all. There was no connection whatsoever. It was Jade versus Rhea, right? And Chelsea, just stuck her nose into this business, like I say, with no kayfabe connection at all whatsoever. You know, and like occasionally, that they cross paths on TV, but outside of that, there was nothing really going on. But for them to, to have this involvement with the title on the line, I'm like, yeah, I guess that's their way of quote turning it into work, um, and so then Chelsea's BFF, who's on the sideline, Piper Niven. I had quite a few things to say about that online, as several people, you know, very well know at this point. That's why I say good morning to everyone except Piper Niven. I went off the way I did. You know what I mean? And and the reason why I did that was because there was a point of the match where Jade did the Big Boss Man, slam, right? And Piper, was being messy, giving a quote 5 out of 10, and she said 5 out of 10, a little sloppy and such. That's just being real messy. I think she's being, giving advice or whatever, right? But see, that's where I went off because last time I checked, Piper's the last one to give anybody a critique or cause anybody sloppy or whatever, give anybody a rating. She's the last one to do that because last time I checked, she was the one who put Nikki Bella on the sideline simply by tripping over the rope and landing on Nikki. You know, um, and so I say that's why Nikki's big part why Nikki's out of action. So as far as that, and last time I checked, nobody was checking for Piper's matches. Nobody was mistaking Piper Niven to be nobody was mistaking Piper Niven to be Asuka, Charlotte, Mercedes, what have you, right? Some of the best. Nobody was checking for in that aspect, right? And so it's just like it's one thing to give a critique, but the way she went about it, right, was just unnecessary. Like I say, it was being messy, it was being petty, it was just to poke at Jade to get under her skin, and she was thinking that the internet was going to be on her side, but ended up blowing up in her face, and of course a lot of people were ended up being in Jade's corner instead, right? So so things Piper thought that it was going to be a tactic to to have people turn on Jade and things like that, and end up blowing up in her face. So this and of course Piper was also talking about how her arm's healing up, but yet your arm was healthy enough, to tweet out some hate and throw shade. What I mean? When nobody needed to. And the thing about it is that you already have enough of the IWC gremlins, taking shots at Jade, and so the optics of it in and of itself is just like you're, if anything, you're adding fuel to the fire. And I know there are people who are telling me to not take it personal, to stay out of their business. You don't know them like that, whatever. I get that, but at the same time, I think from a standpoint of obviously, Jade is, Jade has a way of clapping back, and of course, like she doesn't need anybody to be a spokesperson, because obviously she has enough personality to clap back herself or whatever if she wants to, but she chose to take the high road and ignore that for the moment. But she did a clap back, subliminally on one of the posts recently, and like especially the song and everything about that was definitely dedicated, definitely about Piper. If you know, you know. But all that aside, though, my thing is this. I think just from the sake of seeing, someone constantly, poking somebody, and provoke them without reason. You know, Jade minds her business, right? I look at it from the aspect of, in my shoes, I wouldn't like anybody to just constantly antagonize me for no reason, just poking the bear, poking the bear, poking the bear. And so for me, that's just a part of me that just, just triggered and flicks off. I'm like, nah, that ain't cool. That ain't cool. And the thing about it is that, one thing I can't stand is a bully. And the thing about it is that Piper and Chelsea, those are mean girls. And I don't rock with mean girl energy. I really don't. You know what I mean? Even if it's not directed at me, even from a distance, I mean, that's not cool. That's not cool. And so I'm one of those fans that's going to be on the united front and shut that down, and push back on it. The same way that I was one of those fans who pushed back against, some of the criticisms of the BRP 50. I was one of the ones who's still on the front line. When people were asking about certain somebody, I'm like, nah. There's a reason why. So, so if anything, when it comes to this whole Jade thing, if anything, there's a lot of, like I said, just collective disrespect, towards Jade, just for her, being a Black woman, being confident and everything like that, and all this unnecessary criticism and just, like picking at everything that she does, every little thing that she does, right? For one, she did not botch that move, with the whole wig thing. And I liked how she clapped back, when she showed her natural hair. Thought that was cool, right? And just people, just constantly antagonizing this lady, like for no apparent reason whatsoever. But yet they don't have the same energy, for some of her white counterparts, Chelsea, who blatantly botch, who are, like I said, what I've seen far sloppier things from some of them compared to what I've seen from Jade. I know there are criticisms about her improving in the ring, but at the same time, it comes to a point where I'm not gonna, try to mistake, trying to force her to be the next Bianca in the ring. Like, it gets to a point where it's like, what, I'm not expecting her to be the next Bianca or the next Mercedes in the ring, right? But at the same time, she's definitely come further than where she was before, right? And it comes to a certain point where, certain things you just accept. That's just part of their repertoire, right? And so, like I say, it's really giving off, some of the same antagonizing behavior that that people have had towards Roman, for years, right? And so it's just like, all right, just even like it gets to a point where you just mute and block people, and if necessary, clap back. And it got to a point where Piper ended up deleting that original tweet, even though the internet has receipts. But yeah, so so clearly she realized that that it blew up in her face, right? So yeah, so as far as that's concerned, but yeah, that was just like Jade versus the IWC, and so yeah, like I said, I'm a proud member of the Cargill cartel, if you will, as Jade's fan base is called. And then of course we have Obafemi, defeating Jey Uso, and I like how I like how they threw this little air of uncertainty, if you will. But at first I thought the Brock was going to interfere, But when I saw the match play out the way that it did, and there was no Brock interference, it was a straight clean win. Yeah, okay, and of course, it only turned out that that the Oba turned down the number one contendership, at least for right now, so that he can settle the score with Brock Lesnar in SummerSlam. So now it's been confirmed: Oba versus Brock at SummerSlam, and for the finale, part 3, and this was going to be so clearly, the Viking, the Beast, is going to end up, end up getting slain at home in Minneapolis, at U.S. Bank Arena, that's the or stadium, I guess, the Minnesota, where the Vikings play. That's where, some colors, purple and gold. Brock's a Minnesota guy anyway, so very fitting. And plus, he's more synonymous, I would say, with SummerSlam for the most part than WrestleMania, outside of regular street. But anyway, like I said, as far as that, so he's gonna forsake a shot at either WWE title for right now, and I mean, of course, we see that of course, we saw on Monday Night Raw, that it's been confirmed that Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins are going to have their final confrontation. They're going to close the chapter. They're going to have closure. And not only that, but of course, also I want to say that it's confirmed that Brock challenged Oba to a Hell in a Cell match at SummerSlam, right? So of course that's going to be the finale. That's going to be the part 3. That's how they're in the trilogy, the best way possible, and Hell in a Cell match. So great call. And so other things that happened on Raw, we saw the LA Knight defeated Jimmy Uso, which was on Solo Sikoa coming out to spike Jimmy after the bell. Joe Rodriguez defeated Maxine Dupree. We saw that Rey Mysterio defeated Ethan Page. Chad Gable defeated Jade bobblehead by submission with the ankle lock. We saw that Joe Hendry defeated Austin Theory in singles action, also accompanied by a musical takedown from Hendry and the Street Profits. And so of course, the Judgment Day launched a post-match beat down to Io Sky. Dominic Mysterio was blinded and thwarted when Danhausen's exploded briefcase went off in his face. But also, of course, the biggest key segment of them all, outside of Oba and Brock, but the main one, the exclamation point, of the night was Seth Rollins declaring that he's going to face Roman Reigns for the World Heavyweight Championship at SummerSlam. And so that so he's definitely being built as as the last chapter, for their rivalry, as they've been the ones to carry the company, carry this era, if you will, and what I mean, and of course, Seth Rollins, admitted that that Roman has become a bigger legend of himself, a bigger career than his. Talking about as far as like the WrestleMania main events, a record that will never be broken. 11 main events. I'll say like this when it comes to WrestleMania. To me, that's next. I say that's right next to Taker Streak. Taker Streak's number 1. Roman's main event record number 2. And so yeah, and of course, Shawn Michaels' catalog of matches right there. So the top 3, WrestleMania stars anyway. But yeah, like I said, of course, as far as that, but Seth had to, throw salt in the wound and say that the one thing that Roman's never did was beat him. And so it's really given shades of Rock Austin 3 from WrestleMania 19. And I'll say it's definitely going to be, I'll say the closing chapter for this is definitely going to have to be a SummerSlam, because I don't see Jon Moxley making his return anytime soon. So obviously this is where they have the closure. And the thing is, Roman has not beaten Seth one-on-one where it matters in a title match. So I think it's time for him to finally get this gorilla Donkey Kong off his back and finally put Seth down once and for all. And of course Seth is also just acknowledging, no pun intended, there's a new guard. We're talking about the new generation that's coming in, and the same way that him and Roman were we're in that same position themselves, and so on. So of course, as soon as Let me slow down, of course. Look, Roman pretty much, had to remind Seth, um, when it comes to, someone who did the heavy lifting, if you will, Roman really did more, the heavy lifting to carry the brand, to carry the company that Seth did pretty much. And also the thing about it is that, had Seth not did what he did, we wouldn't have this conversation. We wouldn't be in this place right now. Had Seth not put that chair to Roman's back. So this Seth gaslighting is just like we could see right through it like glass. Like, come on, dude. But at the same time, it's definitely going to be a great finale and just and how this is how they've been synonymous with each other from the very jump. You know what I mean? And how they are, like I said, how they're so closely tied to the hip. You know what I mean? And just to see their paths, like I said, see them cross paths, for one final time, and it's really giving off like a Seth Rollins, um, sort of pseudo retirement tour, if you will. It's really going to be one last dance in the final chapter close in Minnesota. And of course, um, shout out to the Detox on Instagram. Love the caption says the two men who single-handedly took a new generation, carried them on their back. Two men whose careers paralleled in the greatness. The two meccas of the current generation. The Attitude Era had Rock versus Austin. Ruthless Aggression had Cena versus Orton. We got Rollins versus Reigns. There's no denying these two forever changed the game, and whether you want to admit it or not, this will go down as one of the greatest rivalries of all time. In Minnesota, we officially closed the chapter between the Shield. This one is different, and I will be seated to witness my two Shield goats go at it one more time, one last time. That's tough to say. Absolutely right. This is the final chapter. Excuse me. As it pertains to the Shield, and if anything, they're one of the more influential groups, I said influential groups of all time. Yes, I'll say that this was the premier rivalry of this generation. After those, after those aforementioned feuds, right? And so what better way to do it if it's not WrestleMania? Because I don't see this being dragged out, all the way into in the Mania in April. I don't see it being dragged out like that, because eventually it's going to end up being Oba versus Roman down the line. That's inevitable. And and I remember I left the caption, left the comment, saying that Roman versus Oba was going to be bigger than Oba versus Seth. And I know that some people some people kind of felt some type of way about it. And I had to of course shout out to Nene. I think she I guess kind of felt some type of way with the way I said it. But the thing is, no offense to Seth, I don't discredit his career whatsoever. The guy's the main eventer. However, objectively speaking, when you talk about body work, since we like to do rankings and things like that, Roman has had a greater career than Seth. Seth admitted himself, especially when it comes to the WrestleMania main events and just just the way that he's carried the company and things like that. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. The thing about it is there's levels when it comes to this main event stuff, right? It's like I said, Seth Rollins is the main eventer. He's had more world titles than Shawn Michaels. He's not greater than Shawn, but the point is, though, let's say, as far as that's concerned, for instance, Shawn Michaels is a main eventer. The Rock's the main eventer, right? But The Rock just has a bigger career than HBK. Doesn't take anything away from HBK's accomplishments, but at some point you have to come to that conclusion. Like, there's levels to this. So, there's some who are a little bit higher than others, And with the way that I've done rankings, Roman, like I said, the numbers speak for themselves. You know what I mean? And there's no shade. Excuse me, let me slow down. There's no shade to Seth's career, his greatness whatsoever. But let's just call it what it is. Of course, he's the biggest thorn in Roman's side. So I think that's why it's just it's important to have that closure, so that full speed ahead we can eventually have Roman versus Oba. Because that's already been they've already called the shot ever since WrestleMania. So what I mean. So it's just like I definitely don't want to see nothing like that really get in the way and hijack that. So so that's the way I see it. But yeah, that's really what it is. And also shout out to Nikki Blackheart for making her debut on NXT. I was like, all right, now I'm very much impressed. So I definitely look forward to seeing, look forward just to seeing what she has in store. And so that is pretty much it. And of course, NXT is still going to be in great hands anyway, of course. So as far as that's concerned, and then now it is time pretty soon, to give my birthday shout outs. And so on June 27th, June 27th, her turned Grammy winner, her turned 29. Of course, on June 29th, Kawhi Leonard turned 35. The Breakfast Club's own Charlemagne turned 48. Vincent D'Onofrio, better known as Kingpin, turned 67. On June 30th, Mike Tyson, boxing legend, icon. Of course, Iron Mike Tyson turned 60. Terry Funk would have turned 82. Cody Rhodes turned 41. Of course, comedy legend David Allen Greer turned 70. Fantasia turned 42. On July 1st, Princess Diana, of course, rest in peace, would have turned 65. Pamela Anderson turns 59. Evelyn Champagne King turns 66. Missy Misdemeanor Elliott, Rock and Roll Hall of Famer, turns 55. Comedy legend Saturday Night Live's own Dan Aykroyd turns 74. And on July 2nd, Bret the Hitman Hart turns 69. And that's it for the birthdays. And with, and of course, before I go, I'd like to give a word of wisdom. Is that, sorry about that. Before I go, I'd like to give a word of wisdom. Is that is that the God that we serve is a God of structure. The failure of a plan is the plan to fail. And so, and think about it is that in order to succeed, you have to have a plan. In order to succeed, you have to have structure. And God blesses structure. God blesses those who make sure to to put in that as their top priority. And the thing is, when you put God, as I always say, when you put God in first place, you don't have to worry about being in last place. When you put him in first place and prioritize his agenda, he will bless your agenda. So there you go. That's my word of wisdom. Always remember that of course, you're victorious because greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. When you put God in first place, you don't have to worry about being in last place. Please make sure to listen to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever else that you download podcasts. And of course, I'm also on YouTube, youtube.com/@Von West Virginia. Please make sure to like, subscribe for more great content. Thank you very much for listening. And thank you very much for watching. And may this day be the absolute very best day of your life.